Chesterfield, Missouri, was the kind of small town where the hum of daily life moved slowly, almost as if the world outside didn't exist. It was a town where everyone knew everyone else, and the biggest excitement of the year came from the county fair. Life here was peaceful, uneventful, and predictable. The streets were lined with old houses, and the air had a quiet stillness that comforted the residents. There was something about the town's simplicity that made it feel timeless, as though nothing ever truly changed. Jason Martin, a 40-year-old veteran of the Marine Corps, had come to Chesterfield seeking peace and a fresh start. After years of serving overseas, navigating the harsh realities of war, Jason returned home, hoping that this small town would offer him the sanctuary he needed. He had settled into the quiet rhythm of the town with his wife, Laura, and their 12-year-old son, Ben. They lived in a modest house on the outskirts of town, where the quiet streets and friendly neighbors seemed like the perfect escape from the chaos that had once been his life. Jason was determined to leave his past behind and make a new life for his family, one that would shield them from the violence and trauma he had endured during his time in the military. Jason started his own private detective agency, thinking that it would be a way to use his skills for a different purpose, one that didn't involve violence. But the transition from soldier to civilian wasn't easy. The constant tension in his chest, the nightmares and the haunting memories of his time in combat never quite let him go. It was hard to let go of the habits he had developed over the years in the military, always alert, always prepared, always ready for the worst. He tried to focus on his work, but the restlessness remained. And though he tried to push it aside, the sense of failure, the belief that he wasn't truly home, that something was always wrong, lingered. Laura, his wife, worked as a teacher at the local elementary school. She was kind-hearted, patient, and deeply invested in her work, but the strain of being married to someone who struggled so deeply with the scars of war was beginning to show. She noticed how distant Jason had become, how often he returned home late, withdrawn, and lost in his own thoughts. He was always busy with his investigations, spending hours on the phone, looking into cases that never seemed to get resolved. She had tried to be understanding, to support him through his transition, but as the months passed, she felt herself growing increasingly frustrated and confused by his behavior. They had once been so close, but now there seemed to be an insurmountable gap between them, a wall that neither of them knew how to break down. In early June, Jason received a phone call from Jonathan Peterson, a local businessman and old friend. Jonathan now owned a small cafe in the center of town, a place where Jason and he had shared many conversations over the years. Jonathan had always been a reliable friend, someone Jason could trust without question, and when Jonathan called, Jason didn't hesitate to pick up the phone. Jonathan's voice was tight with worry as he explained that his sister, Emily, had gone missing. She had disappeared a few days ago, and despite the efforts of the local police, no one had been able to find any trace of her. The circumstances surrounding her disappearance were murky, and Jonathan was becoming desperate. Jason hesitated. On one hand, it felt like a distraction from his own struggles, another investigation, another case to keep him occupied. But on the other hand, he knew Jonathan needed him, and he couldn't bring himself to turn his back on an old friend in need. He agreed to take the case, though there was a nagging sense of unease in the back of his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into something much bigger than he expected, something that might pull him even further away from his already strained family life. As Jason set out to investigate, the unease he had been carrying only grew. The more he delved into the mystery of Emily's disappearance, the more questions arose. Something about the case didn't sit right. Emily had always been a private person, someone who kept to herself, but it seemed out of character for her to just vanish without a trace. Jason began digging into her past, contacting friends and family, speaking to anyone who might have known her. The picture he started to paint was one of a troubled woman with a complicated history, one that involved strained relationships, hidden secrets, and perhaps more than one man who might have been tied to her disappearance. Meanwhile, his marriage to Lara continued to deteriorate. Jason became more consumed by the case, working late into the night, often neglecting the small, quiet moments that had once defined their life together. Lara, though she tried to be supportive, began to feel the distance between them grow. She could no longer ignore the tension in the house, the silence that had taken over their once vibrant home. Her patience wore thin as she began to wonder if Jason had truly come back from war, or if he was still fighting battles in his mind that she could never understand. The investigation into Emily's disappearance began to take up more of Jason's time than he had anticipated, and as he uncovered deeper layers of deception and hidden relationships, he couldn't shake the feeling that something sinister was at play. He was no longer sure if he was helping a friend or if he had unwittingly stepped into something that could unravel his already fragile life. But as the days passed and the case continued to grow more complex, Jason found himself unable to back down. He was drawn in by a need for answers, a need to solve something that seemed as elusive as peace itself. With each passing day, the tension in his marriage with Lara escalated, and Jason found himself caught between two worlds: his past, which he could never truly leave behind, and the present, which was slipping through his fingers. The case, his marriage, his own sense of self, all of it was beginning to feel like a tangled knot he wasn't sure how to untangle. And as he continued his investigation, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that the answers he was searching for would come at a cost much greater than he had anticipated. As Jason delved deeper into the investigation, a persistent unease began to take root. What had initially appeared to be a straightforward missing persons case gradually unraveled into something far more complicated and troubling. At first, the trail was standard. Emily had last been seen by a bartender and two patrons at a small local dive off Route 63. She had been sitting alone, nursing a drink and speaking intermittently with someone via text message. The bartender remembered her demeanor as distant, distracted, like someone waiting for bad news. The text messages Jason managed to recover from her phone records pointed to a man whose identity remained unknown. Their exchange was brief and coded, but the subtext hinted at intimacy and urgency. Jason's instincts told him that this man was more than just a fleeting romantic interest. He began canvassing people who had known Emily, but few could offer any real insight. Emily had lived an isolated life, rarely attending social functions, never forming close friendships. She had worked as a freelance web designer from home, kept to herself, and rarely spoke about her family. Her brother Jonathan was the exception, although even that relationship had been strained. Jason recalled vague references to family tension from past conversations with Emily, half-finished sentences, nervous glances, an air of restraint any time her brother's name came up. The deeper Jason looked, the more he noticed the inconsistencies in Jonathan's account. Jonathan had described his relationship with Emily as close, but their recent call logs told another story. They had barely spoken over the last 6 months. When they did communicate, the conversations were short and terse. Jason began to wonder whether Jonathan had withheld something from him, something important. At the same time, he couldn't shake the memory of how grateful Emily had once been to him and Lara, how she had spoken of them during one of her difficult periods. That memory gave Jason a renewed sense of responsibility. He wasn't just working a case, he owed her something. While the case consumed more of his time and focus, his marriage continued to suffer. Lara noticed the change. Jason had always been a quiet man, but now he had become almost impenetrable. He answered her questions with vague, incomplete thoughts, kept files locked away, and spent long hours out of the house. She sensed that his mind was elsewhere, possibly even with someone else. Though she had no concrete evidence, the distance between them fed her doubts. She felt forgotten, pushed aside in favor of a case that had grown into an obsession. She didn't know if Jason was chasing closure or trying to escape something he couldn't name. Their arguments became more frequent. Some were small, the forgotten dinner, the unread message, but others cut deeper. Lara accused him of being emotionally absent, of no longer caring about their life together. Jason, in turn, withdrew even more, unable to articulate the growing chaos in his mind. He didn't know how to reassure her when he wasn't sure of anything himself. Every time he tried to bridge the gap between them, the silence that followed only widened the divide. Their home, once filled with warmth and shared routines, had grown cold, filled with silence and the echoes of unspoken grievances. Jason continued to follow the thread of Emily's last known contacts and stumbled upon a name that turned his attention in an entirely new direction: Victor Hale. Victor was known to the Chesterfield Police Department for his involvement in the local drug trade. He had a reputation: violent, manipulative, and dangerous. Jason pulled together fragments from Emily's online activity and discovered that she had met Victor through a support group for trauma survivors. Their communication had started innocently, rooted in shared pain and emotional vulnerability. But soon, it had turned into clandestine meetings, off-the-grid phone calls, and encrypted emails. Jason realized that Emily had been keeping a part of her life hidden, even from her brother. Her connection to Victor wasn't accidental. It had become something intense and secretive. Further investigation revealed surveillance footage from a gas station near the county line. Emily's car had been spotted there late one night, with Victor in the passenger seat. It was the last confirmed sighting of her. The timestamp was 3 days before she was reported missing. Jason felt the pieces beginning to fit, though they painted a dark and complex picture. Emily hadn't just disappeared, she had slipped into something dangerous, something she didn't fully understand or couldn't control. Whether she had gone willingly or under threat remained unclear, but Victor was the key. Jason began compiling everything he had: the texts, the footage, the inconsistencies, and Jonathan's statements. He felt himself circling closer to the truth, but the cost was rising. Every late night, every lead followed, every revelation came at the expense of his home life. Lara had stopped asking questions. Ben avoided eye contact. The silence in the house had grown unbearable. Jason knew he was losing them, but he couldn't stop. Something about the case gripped him with a force he couldn't explain. It was no longer about duty. It was personal. Emily had once trusted him, and now she was gone. He prepared to confront Victor, fully aware that the meeting could turn volatile. This wasn't a man who cooperated with authority. Jason knew he'd be walking into a situation without guarantees. But he had questions that needed answers. What had happened between Victor and Emily? Was she running from someone, or had she trusted the wrong person? The investigation had evolved into something darker than Jason had anticipated. Every answer uncovered only led to more uncertainty, and every step forward seemed to blur the line between professional obligation and personal obsession. He had gone looking for the truth, but what he found instead was a reflection of his own unraveling life, haunted by betrayal, defined by silence, and hurtling toward a reckoning he could no longer avoid. The path Jason had followed led him deeper into a labyrinth of deception, revealing a world he hadn't anticipated, a world where the missing person he had sworn to find was no longer a victim, but a participant in something far more disturbing. Victor Hale, long suspected of being Emily's secret lover and potential abuser, turned out to be connected to an organized criminal network based in neighboring counties. Jason found documented ties between Victor and a regional syndicate involved in drug trafficking, document forgery, and human smuggling. Surveillance photos and financial records linked Emily directly to some of these activities. Jason traced a series of anonymous cash deposits into an offshore account created under a false identity. The account had been accessed only once in the weeks leading up to Emily's disappearance. The trail pointed not toward a kidnapping or a violent end, but toward a calculated escape. Emily had not been taken. She had vanished by choice. Yet, the deeper truth, Jason soon realized, was more grotesque than he could have imagined. Through encrypted files hidden on a burner laptop retrieved from one of Victor's abandoned safe houses, Jason uncovered a folder labeled with a name he recognized immediately: Jonathan Peterson. Inside were a series of personal messages between Jonathan and Emily stretching back years. At first, the exchanges appeared strained and mundane, like communications between distant siblings. But as Jason read further, the language shifted, growing darker, more intimate, laced with guilt and veiled accusations. A single image stopped Jason cold. An old photo of a child, no more than 3 or 4 years old, with features eerily resembling both Jonathan and Emily. The implications were overwhelming. With forensic evidence and discrete DNA analysis, the truth surfaced. Emily had borne a child, and the father was her brother, Jonathan. The records indicated the child had been hidden in a private care facility registered under a false name. Jason's shock turned into revulsion. What had begun as a search for a missing woman had spiraled into the unearthing of generational trauma, incest, and betrayal. Emily, once thought to be a victim of her own vulnerability, was now emerging as both the wounded and the complicit. Jason knew the end was near. He had to face her. He returned to Emily's house, half abandoned and silent, tucked away on a dead-end street outside Chesterfield. Dust clung to the windows. The mailbox overflowed with unopened letters. It looked like no one had lived there in weeks, but the front door was unlocked. Inside, he found her, standing in the center of the living room as if she had been waiting. Her face was thinner, older somehow, and her eyes carried no trace of the warmth he once remembered. She did not run. She did not plead. She simply stood there, calm and composed, and then, without hesitation, she told him everything. She spoke of a childhood twisted by secrecy and neglect, of years of unspoken trauma, of the lines that had blurred between her and Jonathan during their youth. She described the child born out of confusion, pain, and misguided affection. When Victor had entered her life, he offered her a way out: money, protection, anonymity. Emily had planned to disappear with her child, to vanish from the life that had defined her by shame. But things went wrong. Jonathan had found out. Threats followed. Victor offered her a plan, but by then the danger had escalated beyond control. Jason listened, numb. His mind rejected the images forming with each word. He had spent weeks trying to find Emily, only to realize that she had been hiding from her own history. The brother he had once trusted, the man who had come to him for help, had been at the heart of the nightmare. And Emily, broken, yes, but also deliberate, had chosen silence until now. Jason's sense of reality collapsed beneath the weight of the truth. He left the house without arresting her, without calling the police, without speaking a word. The rules no longer made sense. He walked through Chesterfield's empty streets, unsure of who he was anymore. For so long, he had defined himself as protector, soldier, investigator. Now, he felt like a man haunted by shadows, unsure whether he had brought light to the truth or simply uncovered more darkness. He returned home to Lara. The tension in the air was palpable. He couldn't keep it inside any longer. He told her everything. About Emily, the child, Jonathan, the lies, the danger. He confessed his own failure to see the truth earlier, and the guilt that had consumed him as he became more immersed in the case. Lara listened, but with each revelation her expression grew harder, her body more distant. The man standing in front of her was no longer the husband she had known. He had become a stranger, someone who had walked willingly into the depths of something unspeakable and returned changed. Lara didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. Instead, there was a cold finality in the silence that followed his confession. She stepped back, not in fear, but in quiet resolve. She no longer knew if she could trust him, not because he had betrayed her, but because he had crossed a boundary into something from which there might be no return. The damage between them, once subtle, was now a gaping chasm. Jason felt it in his bones. The truth he had uncovered had cost him not only his peace of mind, but the only anchor he had left. The case was nearing its end, but the fallout had just begun. Nothing in Chesterfield would ever be the same. And neither would he. In the weeks following the revelation, a heavy stillness settled over Jason and Lara's lives. The air in Chesterfield no longer felt familiar. Every corner of the town held memories now tainted by betrayal, by loss, by the things they could not unsee or forget. The truth about Emily, about Jonathan, about the hidden sickness in the heart of their quiet town, had left a mark that neither of them could erase. Their home, once a place of refuge, now echoed with the weight of silence and uncertainty. Jason spent days avoiding his office, the sign of his agency still hanging over the narrow door in the downtown strip, though he knew he would never walk through it again. Files gathered dust, unanswered calls filled the voicemail, and the once clear purpose that had driven him was gone. He could no longer bring himself to look at his casework, to review witness reports, or to feel anything but emptiness when he opened a folder. The job had taken too much, and now he realized he had nothing left to give. He closed the agency quietly. There was no announcement, no farewell letter to the community. He removed the sign one morning just after dawn and locked the door for the last time. The decision wasn't just professional, it was personal. He could no longer define himself as a detective, not after what he had learned, not after how deeply the case had unsettled everything he believed about justice, about family, about himself. At home, he and Lara moved carefully around one another. The air between them was still heavy, but not with anger. Instead, it was filled with the cautious steps of two people trying to find their way back from the edge. Lara had listened to everything Jason had told her, and though her heart ached from the weight of it, she hadn't left. She had stayed, not out of obligation, but because something in her still held on to the belief that they might rebuild. But they both understood that rebuilding couldn't happen in Chesterfield. The town had become a monument to what they had endured. Everywhere Jason looked, he saw reminders of his failure, of his blindness, of the darkness he had uncovered. Lara, too, could not walk down the school hallway without feeling eyes on her, without hearing the murmurs that never said her name aloud but were always about her husband. The walls were closing in, not by force but by memory. It was Jason who first brought up the idea of leaving. The suggestion came one quiet evening as they sat in the living room, the television muted, the curtains drawn. He had thought about it for days, starting over somewhere new, somewhere clean, where Ben could finish growing up without the shadow of what had happened hanging over him. Lara didn't answer immediately, but in the days that followed, she began packing small things without needing to say a word. It was the only direction that made sense. They chose a town 2 states away, a place neither of them had ever lived but that felt far enough to be different and close enough to not feel like exile. Jason found work with a logistics company, something far removed from investigations, from conflict, from secrets. Lara found a position teaching again, though it took time for her to trust her own voice in a classroom. Ben, quiet through it all, adjusted faster than either of them expected. The change of scenery gave him the room to breathe, to forget the whispers that had once followed him in the school hallways. The move was quiet, without ceremony. No goodbye party, no farewells to friends or neighbors. They left Chesterfield in the early morning, their car loaded with the few things they still considered important. As the sun rose behind them, Jason looked at the rearview mirror and saw the town shrink into a blur. He didn't speak. Neither did Lara. There was nothing left to say. Their new house was smaller but filled with light. It sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac surrounded by tall trees and the occasional sound of laughter from neighborhood children. It wasn't home yet, but it wasn't haunted either. Each day they added something small: curtains in the kitchen, photos on the hallway walls, a new couch for the living room. It was slow work, but deliberate, like learning to walk again after injury. Jason spent his evenings on the porch, watching the sunset over a street he did not yet know. Sometimes Lara joined him, and they would sit in silence side by side, not as the people they had once been, but as the people they were learning to become. There was no guarantee of healing, no assurance that they would ever fully forget what had happened. But they had made a choice to begin again, together. The move did not erase the past. It did not heal the wounds or make the nightmares stop, but it offered a space in which those wounds could be acknowledged without consuming them. The town they left behind had taken much from them, but it had not taken everything. In the quiet of their new beginning, Jason and Lara began to rediscover what remained. A year had passed since Jason and Lara left Chesterfield behind, and while the passage of time had brought some sense of normalcy, the weight of the past was never fully shaken off. They had settled into a rhythm in their new town, a place with wide streets, quiet neighborhoods, and a sense of anonymity they hadn't realized they needed. The initial flurry of unpacking, settling in, and finding their way had given way to the slower, more deliberate process of rebuilding their lives. Jason, while no longer running his detective agency, found work in a small investigative firm. His days were filled with research, background checks, and surveillance. Nothing too personal, nothing that reached into the depths of people's lives the way his previous cases had. He had consciously made the decision to keep his work separate from his own emotions, to stay clear of cases that could pull him back into the chaos of his past. It was a calculated choice, one born from necessity rather than desire. He couldn't afford to become too involved again, not with the shadows of Emily and Jonathan still haunting his thoughts. His work had become functional, almost robotic, an escape from the constant reminders of the family he had once had. Lara, too, had found a position at a local school teaching again, though her confidence had been shaken. The past still lingered in the way she interacted with her students, the way she held back from connecting too deeply, as though any emotional investment might risk bringing back the hurt she had learned to live with. She had made new friends in the town, though they were never quite the same as the ones she had left behind. These new relationships were polite, distant, guarded. No one asked too many questions about her life before, and she was grateful for that. She did her best to move forward, but some nights she would catch herself staring at a photograph of her family from the past, wondering if it would ever be possible to return to the way things were. Jason and Lara found comfort in routine. They spent quiet weekends walking through the park, enjoying the anonymity of their new life. Ben, now a teenager, had grown used to the change, though he still sometimes looked at his parents with a sadness in his eyes that neither Jason nor Lara could fully understand. The boy, who had once been wide-eyed and curious, had grown quieter, more introspective, as if he carried the weight of their shared history without knowing how to express it. They tried their best to offer him a sense of stability, though they couldn't help but wonder if the scars of their past would ever truly heal for him. While the town felt like a new chapter, the echoes of their former life still lingered. Jason would often find himself walking through the familiar streets of their new town, his mind drifting back to Chesterfield. The friends, the betrayal, the heartbreak. He would catch a glimpse of a familiar face or hear a name that tugged at his memory, and for a moment, he would be back there. The shadows would creep back in, but each time they were less overpowering. He had learned to live with the ghosts, to allow them to fade into the background of his life. Still, he couldn't help but wonder how different things might have been if he had never taken on that last case. If he had never learned the truth about Emily and Jonathan, if he had never uncovered the darkness in their lives, what would his life have looked like then? Lara, too, was haunted by what they had left behind. She sometimes wondered if things could have been different, if they had stayed in Chesterfield, if they had found a way to move forward there. But every time she thought about it, she realized the past was irrevocable. She had accepted it in a way. What mattered now was the life they were trying to build in this new town, the future that lay ahead of them. But as she sat in their new living room, watching the sun set over the small town, she would sometimes catch herself longing for something that felt like home again. The more time passed, the more Jason and Lara came to understand that some wounds couldn't be healed by just moving away. Some things, once broken, could never be truly fixed. But they had learned to live with it. They had learned to live with the weight of their decisions, the choices that had led them to this point. And though the ghosts of the past still haunted them, they had managed to carve out a life that, while not perfect, was their own. Jason and Lara were no longer defined by the events that had shattered their world. They had moved on, but only because they had no other choice. They had learned that sometimes survival was not about moving forward in a straight line, but about finding a way to keep going despite the chaos. They didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while they felt a sense of quiet acceptance in their new life, one where the past, though never forgotten, no longer held them captive. As time passed, Jason and Lara gradually found a semblance of peace in their new life. The sharp edges of their pain had dulled, not entirely gone, but no longer as overwhelming as they once were. The quiet routine of their days in the small town became their anchor, and despite the shadows of the past that occasionally crept back, they began to build something that resembled stability. Jason often found himself reflecting on the course of his life, especially the events that had led him to uncover so many painful truths. He thought about the choices he had made, the moment when he had taken on Emily's case, the point when his life had veered off its expected path. He wondered how things might have unfolded differently if he had chosen to walk away, if he had ignored the signs and left the investigation untouched. Perhaps he would have kept his old life intact, with its familiar routines and predictable peace. But the truth was, Jason knew that some things were beyond his control. The pieces of his life had already been set in motion long before he had made that fateful decision. The secrets, the betrayals, the pain, they were not his to fix. They were part of a larger story, one that he had unwittingly stepped into. In the quiet of their new home, Jason understood that his past had shaped him into the man he was now. It had taken him down roads he hadn't chosen, forced him to confront ugly truths, but it had also taught him resilience. He had survived, and that survival, though hard-won, gave him a new perspective on life. Jason knew that the man who had walked into Chesterfield to find answers was not the same man who now sat in his living room, watching the sun set in the same way every evening. He had changed, as had his marriage, as had their future. Lara, too, had learned to accept what had happened, to let go of the fantasies of what could have been. She no longer replayed the past in her mind, wondering if there was a way to undo the mistakes or recover what had been lost. Instead, she focused on what she could control, the present. Her relationship with Jason had evolved. The emotional distance that had once consumed them had gradually receded, and though it hadn't completely disappeared, they had found a way to move forward together. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was theirs. She had begun to see her own growth as well. The woman who had once been consumed by grief and anger had learned to embrace the complexities of life, and in that acceptance, she found strength. Their new life was a far cry from the one they had left behind. There were no longer any reminders of the past, no haunting whispers of betrayal. Their home, though modest, was a sanctuary, a place they had built together, brick by brick, day by day. The pain of the past no longer had a hold on them, though it still lingered in small ways, in quiet moments when their minds would drift to old memories. They had learned, over time, that it was possible to carry the weight of those memories without being crushed by them. Ben had grown as well. He was no longer the boy who had once carried the silent burden of his parents' troubled relationship. Though his past would always be a part of him, he had found his own peace in the change. The town, too, had become a place of healing for him. The quiet, the calm, the simple life they had chosen had allowed him to reconnect with his own sense of self. He no longer carried the same heaviness in his eyes, and though there were still moments of doubt, moments where the echoes of the past crept in, he was beginning to understand that his family had survived. They had made it through the hardest of times. Jason and Lara's story, in the end, was not one of redemption or complete healing, but of acceptance. They had come to terms with the darkness in their past and had learned to live with it, to carry it as part of their journey rather than something that defined them. They had made a choice to move forward, to find new hope even after the worst of tragedies. Their life was not perfect, but it was real, and in its imperfection they had discovered a new kind of peace, a peace that came not from erasing the past, but from learning to live with it. In the quiet of their new town, as the days passed, Jason and Lara understood that the road ahead would still be filled with challenges, but they no longer feared what lay in the future. They had found something far more valuable: the ability to move forward with a sense of purpose, a sense of hope, and a renewed commitment to one another. The darkness of the past would always be with them, but it would no longer be the thing that defined them. Instead, they would define their own story. And in that, they had found their redemption.